If you are like me and are totally frustrated with the process of scheduling your podcast interviews and going back and forth with your guests to try to find just the right time for your conversation, you're going to love today's video. I'm going to introduce you to the calendar tool that has absolutely changed my podcast interview process and made my life so much easier. And that's what we're looking for, right? So let's get right to it. Hey y'all, Crystal here today. So I wanted to show you what it was like to use my favorite calendar tool, Calendly. Yeah, it's kind of hard to say when you say calendar and then Calendly together in the same sentence, but this has been my go-to resource for scheduling podcast interviews and making my life so much easier. So, funny story, I actually just switched from a free version of Calendly to the paid version. And we'll get into the options and the different ways that you can use it, but I love this platform so much. So let's just dive right in. I'm actually on the calendly.com main screen. And if you want to start a free trial, then you can go ahead and sign up with them, or you can look into pricing or the features. But I actually want to get into what my Calendly looks like on the back end. So let's jump right in. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to show you the back end of what Calendly looks like for me. That way you can kind of understand how I use this for my business and for my podcast. So I have multiple different, let's say, events set up here, and they are different based upon what kind of time someone is scheduling with me. Now, if you do have the free option, I think that you're limited to how many events you can have, whether it's one or two. But this is one of the reasons why I upgraded to the paid version, is because I wanted to have multiple ways that someone could get onto my calendar. So I have discovery calls for how I want to meet with people that are interested in my course if they have questions. I have student calls where I get testimonials from my students based on their going through Proffitt Podcasting, which is my podcast course. If you're interested in checking it out, I will put a link below this video. I also have my podcast coaching clients, and then I have podcast interviews for me to be on someone else's podcast. And then I also have the podcast interviews for the Proffitt Podcast, which is the one that we're going to dig into today so you can see. But up here at the top, we have event types, which is everything we just went through here. Then we have scheduled events. And for privacy reasons, I don't want to show y'all everybody that's coming up on my schedule, but it'll tell me, hey, on this date, you have a time scheduled with this person, and I'll show you how they actually get on the schedule in a second, but it has a running schedule of all the people that are coming up. And then the workflows is actually a new feature that Calendly just came out with, and it allows you to set up automations like send a text reminder, send an email reminder, send them a thank you, after your interview is over with. But let's dig into what the back end of my podcast Calendly looks like so you can see how you want to set yours up. So first and foremost, you go in and you name your event. So my event name is the Proffitt Podcast Interview. That way I know that someone is getting on my schedule to have an interview with me for my podcast. And then underneath, it asks for your location. Are you doing your interviews in Zoom? And then you can edit it right here. So you could do a custom, which I did Squadcast, which is where I do my podcast interviews. But there are other options. You have a Google Meet, a Zoom, GoToMeeting, and all kinds of other places that you can choose. But I used custom and I used Squadcast. And this shows up whenever someone is booking a call, and we'll show you that in a second. But it's kind of nice to know, like, okay, this is going to be a Zoom call. I already have Zoom. We're good. If someone sees Squadcast and they've never seen it before, they could ask a question and say, is this something, do I need to download? Do I need to have an app installed? Do I need anything extra? And you could tell people, which is one of the things that I love about podcast interviews and being prepared, you can let them know ahead of time, this is what you need. This is what you don't need. Worry about this. Don't worry about that. You can put all of that information in your scheduling link so they are better prepared. So let's go down to description and instructions. So I say, be sure you've read the show guidelines prior to your scheduled interview time. If you have not already, I do have a video and a podcast episode about podcast show guidelines. So make sure you check that out. But it says, I'll send you the link to our interview the day before or the day of. Please reach out if you have further questions. So this is important simply because I want people to feel very confident and comfortable whenever we are going to have an interview. If they have questions, I want them to know, hey, please reach out. And I can actually link to my show notes or my show guidelines right here if I wanted to, but I just usually send them to my guest or their podcast management team because a lot of people have been reaching out that have hired teams that is either a virtual assistant or a podcast guesting like squad, like it's their hype squad. And I talk to them and I say, here's the show guidelines, and they're so appreciative. So that's super awesome. So I'm just going to click cancel in case I check something and say, I don't want to save a new feature. But it says, when can people book this event? This is where the magic happens. So prior to having Calendly, I used to go back and forth with whoever I was going to interview. And they would say, this time works for me, but it wouldn't work for my schedule. And then I would propose a new time. And it just was this whole back and forth in emails. And it was so frustrating, I'm sure for them, but I know for sure for me. So what I love about this is I can book days and times according to my Google Calendar, right? Like this is a big piece of the puzzle. And I can set aside specific days of the week that I want to do podcast interviews. And if you're brand new to podcasting, I highly recommend you do this. Protect your time. Don't let your podcast and all the interviews and all the other things that you have to do control your time. You need to have like a rein it all in and say, I'm going to set the boundaries for my schedule. So what I do is I set 60 minutes just because usually with the pre-talk before we get into the good stuff, and then a little bit afterwards, I tend to chat with my interviewee. So what I'll do is I set aside about 5 to 15 minutes in the beginning, 5 to 15 minutes at the end, and think probably around 30-minute conversation is how long our interview will be. I do 60 minutes. You can choose whatever works best. You can even do a custom time, whether it's 90 minutes or 180 minutes, however long the conversation is going to be. And then from there, you go down to your date range. And then it says, events can be scheduled over 120 calendar days. I set that up. I think it defaults to about 60. So it lets people know, okay, you can see about, let's say 2 to 3 months of my calendar whenever I send you the link. I have taken off several months of interviews intentionally, and we can talk about that in a second, but I wanted people to give them the ability to schedule far into the future. So what you can do is go to edit, and then it says over a period of rolling days. That's the option I've chosen. Or it could be a specific date range. So let's say you knew in the next month you wanted to schedule 5 interviews. Well, you could literally select the first of that month and the last day of that month. And that's the only time that someone can book for you because you don't want to plan really far out into the future. You can set those boundaries or, like it says, indefinitely, and they could book themselves 2 years down the road. I mean, that's like really far out in the future, but you can do that here. But what I do is over a period of rolling days, 120 calendar days, and you can pick business days if that works for you. You can change this to a different number of days, but this is what I've selected. So then we go down. I'm in the central time zone, so I will put that because it makes my life easier. I know that I am doing my dates and my times correctly on my calendar. So whenever they go out, people will see the reflection of the time zones in there. And we'll talk about the conversions and all that stuff in a little bit. But if you do need help with converting time zones and doing all that, Calendly can help you, which is really cool because I always talk to people in different time zones and it confuses me. And I don't want them to be confused because I don't want us to miss each other on a great interview. So let's go down to availability. This is where I geek out and I get so excited. So if you already have existing Calendly calendars set up, and this is actually what I did recently when I added a bunch of new events, I can copy my availability from another calendar and put it to this one. So if we were pretending like this was a brand new event, I could copy like maybe my coaching calls. Like, okay, I'll do coaching calls and podcast interviews on that day. So I can copy my availability from my coaching calls calendar to this calendar. So I hope that makes sense. Put in the comments below if you have questions about that. But what I like is the boundaries. Like, I'm a huge boundaries person. I love the idea of making my schedule work for me, not the other way around. And so, what I've done is I have set up my podcast interviews. This may change in the future, but for now, as of me recording this, I'm only doing podcast interviews on Wednesdays and Thursdays from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. or 3:15 to 4:15. And this is what works for my schedule as of right now. And you can see I actually don't have like the whole week of October 19th is blocked off. You can't even get on my calendar then because I know I have something fun. I have like my book launch is coming up. So yay, actually I have it right here. So Start a Binge-Worthy Podcast. It comes out on October 20th, 2020. Grab your copy if you have not already. But that's my book launch week. And I knew a long time ago, I don't want to deal with podcast interviews on that week because I'm going to be busy focusing on the book launch. So you can look at your promotional calendar and say, okay, when do I actually want to be doing interviews? When do I have the capacity? Like maybe when you're creative time, like you're in that creative zone, you don't want to stop and do a podcast interview. So take that into consideration when you're planning out when you're going to do your interviews. But if you ever want to change it, or let's say you wanted to add a time on a Tuesday, how do you do that? Click on the day. And then it says I'm unavailable as of now. I can add a time interval. I could add 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. And then it would add it. I could just apply it to this day only, or I could apply it to all Tuesdays. And this usually like you do the initial setup and you don't have to mess with it as much if you have a pretty consistent calendar. Or you could apply it to Tuesdays and Thursdays because those are the days that would work for you. Or you could just do specific dates that, again, going back to the concept, if you're just going to do podcast interviews during a certain month of the year or maybe a few months, then this could work for you as well as far as the feature goes. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to click apply to only October 13th. And now someone could book an interview during this time. I'm going to go in, and if you don't want to have that availability anymore, you can simply hit delete, click cancel. Oh, wait, no, you have to click apply. There we go. So it's gone. So that's how you add your availability. And what's really cool, if you go into advanced, I love this so much because you can set the frequency between your time slots. So you're not running from one podcast interview to another. So if someone books at 1 p.m., you don't have a time slot right at 2 p.m. where you're like, okay, we gotta wrap it up. We gotta get off this call. No, you have a 30-minute buffer that you can make sure that you wrap up what you're saying. You can go have a little coffee break, go have a little bathroom break, snack break, whatever you need in between. And you can control that here with the time increments between each slot. But I love being able to control how many are scheduled in one day. I'd never want any more than 2 podcast interviews. And honestly, I never want more than 2 in a week's time. But because I'm only available 2 days a week to do interviews, I'm okay if I have to squish in 2 interviews back to back. I'm okay with that. And then no one can schedule less than 24 hours in advance. So no one can hop in at this time today and be like, oh, she's available at this time tomorrow. It doesn't allow me to do that, which is awesome. Really protect your time. And then event buffers. So like I said, 30-minute buffer before or after the event. You can change all of this information. But let's get down to, I'm going to click cancel. Okay. we're going to go to Invitee Questions. This is where you can start collecting information about your podcast guest that will make your life as the host so much easier later. So much easier. I love this feature because it gives me their name and their email. They have to give me this information before they can book an interview. And then it says, please provide a short bio, 2 to 3 sentences. This is something that I collect on my end, so I have it whenever I'm ready to promote a podcast episode. By collecting that information here, I don't have to hunt it down whenever it's time for me to promote this interview. Another thing is, what will you be promoting on the podcast? I like to go check out what someone is promoting before we even get on the interview. So I can tell them, hey, the link didn't work. I've actually had this happen a few times. The link that you provided didn't work. Do you have a different link? Do you want to promote something else? Or I could say, hey, what you had planned to talk about doesn't really align with my audience. Do you have something else to talk about? So you can go in and add new questions. You could do just a question here where you type in the information. You can make it required or not required. You could have multiple lines. You could do radio buttons that say yes, no, maybe, any kind of information that you need to collect before your interview. I do this. I fill out this information for my coaching calls and whenever I do testimonial interviews for my students, because I ask them, like, where are you in the stage of creating your podcast? So it's super helpful for you to collect that information before you even hop on your interview. So the next thing is going down to notifications. So you can customize this to let people know, like, hey, you're on my schedule. Congrats. And I like this because I can send them to, instead of just what happens in Calendly, I can send them to a page on my website. So it feels a little bit more custom, a little more personalized. I really like that touch. And then cancellations. If I have to cancel, they'll get a notification that the event was canceled, reschedule, or if we need to reschedule, there's an option to do that whenever they receive an email. Then we have reminders, follow-up emails. You can customize so much of this. I don't know how much you can customize if you are on the free plan, but I know that you at least get the email confirmations. That is for sure. And then text reminders. This is new. I can get a text before I'm about to go on an interview, which is very helpful. So I don't forget. So I'm like, oh, wait, I got an interview in an hour. I got to make sure and wrap everything else up and be ready to give them my full attention. All right, so let's go down. Again, like I said, the confirmation page, I can go to an external site. I have a web page set up that says, you're on my schedule. You are officially on my calendar. If you have any other questions, reach out to me and I give them my email address. So it's really helpful to make sure you have that communication between you and the person that you're going to interview. All right, so then collect payments. I don't use this feature because I don't do coaching, like one-on-one coaching necessarily this way. I have a different invoice processing system. But if you did and you needed to collect payments, this is a way that you could do that. It's another cool feature. But I already know you're wondering, what does this look like? What does this look like when someone is booking a call, right? Because I have just shown you all of the backend information. Now you want to know, what does this look like for somebody that's actually looking at this? So let's go to the live page of what it looks like. So here we are. And what I love about this, and I mentioned this earlier, is I've integrated my Google Calendar to my schedule. So even though it didn't show up necessarily on the back end in Calendly, if I have a dentist appointment, if I have something going on with my son's school, if I have something where I'm out of town and I've marked myself busy in my Google Calendar, I will be unavailable on that day and at that time in Calendly because there's an integration. I love this so much because I don't have to go back and say, oh, I got to do this. As long as it's on my Google Calendar, then we're golden. So this is what it looks like for somebody visiting my Calendly link for the podcast. So it says the Proffitt Podcast interview. Be sure you've read the show notes or the show guidelines before our scheduled time, all the things that we talked about on the back end. This is the information. It's going to be 1 hour. We're using Squadcast. And then if I were to click this date right here, then it gives me the time options. I have one option to choose from. So I'm going to go to a different date and see. Let's see, November on a Wednesday on the 11th. We'll click on it. It gives you multiple options to choose when you would want to do your interview. So if you are my guest, you're looking at this, you're like, okay, 1 p.m. sounds good. You click on 1 p.m., you click confirm. These are all the questions that we talked about that pop up. So they would have to put in their name, their email, if there are any other guests that they want to add. I haven't really had anybody use this feature, but then they would provide their short bio, and you can see this little star. That means it's a required question. They have to answer that or it won't submit anything. And then the podcast guest question is, what will you be promoting on the podcast? Please attach links. So it has that here, and then it has send a text reminder too, and they could input their number. That's not required. That's an optional. And then it says schedule the event. But what I love is over here, it gives them again, okay, it's on Wednesday, November 11th from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. So it has the entire workflow of everything that we just talked about. This is what it looks like on your guest, like while they're looking at it, to book an interview with you for your podcast. But that's all I have for you today for this Calendly tutorial. I hope that you found it helpful and it will make creating and scheduling podcast interviews that much easier for you. But if you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up and subscribe below. That way you don't miss our future podcasting and online business videos that we put out every single week. Make sure you check out these other videos right here that are all about podcasting and creating your online business. And remember, keep it up. We all have to start somewhere.